Welcome to the Food Revolution Summit, where we explore how you can heal your body and your world with food. This is Ocean Robbins, and I am joined by my dad and colleague, John Robbins, in welcoming our friend and guest, Dr. Susan Pierce Thompson. Susan Pierce Thompson, PhD. Welcome to the Food Revolution Summit, where we explore how you can heal your body and your world with food. This is Ocean Robbins, and I am joined by my dad and colleague, John Robbins, in welcoming our friend and guest, Dr. Susan Pierce Thompson. Susan Pierce Thompson, PhD, is an adjunct associate professor of brain and cognitive sciences at the University of Rochester and an expert in the psychology of eating. She is president of the Institute for Sustainable Weight Loss and founder of the worldwide Bright Line Eating movement. Her first two books, including Bright Line Eating, became instant New York Times bestsellers and Hay House classics. Her work weaves the neuroscience of food addiction with powerful insights from positive psychology, internal family systems, and 12-step recovery to outline a roadmap for achieving true integrity and self-authorship around food. Food Revolution Network has been proud to partner with Susan in helping people in over 100 countries to release more than 300,000 excess pounds. I think she is on to the most compelling and effective breakthrough in the history of our understanding of weight loss. So now, Susan, we are so appreciative of your groundbreaking work and so excited for this time with you. And now for this interview, I'm going to hand it over to my dad and colleague, John Robbins.
Well, thank you, Ocean, for that introduction. And thank you, Susan, for being with us once again.
Oh, thank you, John and Ocean. It's such a pleasure and such a privilege.
Well, it is for us as well to have you and bring your voice, your wisdom to our audience. As I was listening to Ocean's introduction a moment ago, and as he was mentioning some of the many things that you've accomplished, I was impressed again, as anyone would be, but all the more so because I know that much earlier in your life, you were on a merry-go-round with many of the most addictive substances on the planet, including crystal meth and freebase cocaine. I remember you saying that for literally decades, you attended a 12-step meeting almost every day. Susan, it's been said that all great journeys begin in the dark. So let's start there. I know you've told the story of your food and addiction journey often, but most of our listeners haven't heard it. Susan, would you be willing to share it with us now?
Sure, John. Yeah. I started doing drugs when I was 14. And, I had a weight problem in my head at that point. It wasn't huge on my body, but I gravitated toward drugs that would help me manage my eating. And also I liked the stimulation and the kind of, they just made me feel really good. And I was a rule breaker, but they escalated out of control really quickly. And even though I was a really good student early in grade school, I ended up going to 3 different high schools and then ultimately dropping out of high school. And by the time I was 19, I was a high school dropout and a crack addict and a prostitute and didn't have a key to a place that I lived, was crashing here and there in San Francisco where I lived. And I got clean and sober, really struck clean and sober out of the blue. I got taken to a 12-step meeting on a first date with some random guy that I'd met at a gas station at 3 a.m. It was quite a coincidence because I'd hit bottom spiritually, emotionally that very morning in the crack house, had walked out the door and didn't know where to go. And I happened to have a date that night, and this guy took me to a meeting, and I haven't had a drink or a drug since. That was August 9th of 1994. So it's, been well over 2 decades, and I'm 46 now. I was 20 then, and I packed on weight really fast after that. But, it's interesting, John, because food addiction is something you can kind of function with. I know there are functional alcoholics, and I've known a few of them in my life. And, but food, I was able to use food addictively and, graduate from UC Berkeley with highest honors and speak at the graduation, and then really dove into studying the brain. I just got fascinated. Like, how does a brain like mine just go so far off the rails? I never intended to get that bad. It just sort of felt like a creeping non-choice. Like it was just this thing that happened, and suddenly I was where I was. So my education continued, and I ended up ultimately as a psychology professor with a PhD in brain and cognitive sciences, and taught psychology, got tenured, taught for many, many years until the Sprite line eating thing took over my life a few years ago.
Well, as someone who's faced and overcome methamphetamine addiction and crack cocaine addiction, you have some standing when you say that food addiction is the hardest of them all to beat.
Yeah.
Why is that, Susan? What makes food the hardest addiction of them all to overcome?
There's a lot of reasons why food is the hardest. I think, first of all, can I just say food addiction is real? We could talk about that separately. It's something that's actually controversial still to a lot of folks, which blows my mind a little bit. But assuming that we can agree that food addiction is real, it's harder than heroin and crack cocaine and crystal meth to beat. Because on the one hand, it's up there in the strength of the addiction itself. And we have good data on that in humans, in rodents. They have different ways in the addiction sciences to measure the strength of an addiction. But sugar, for example, is an extremely strong addiction. Rats that are pre-addicted to intravenous shots of cocaine and hooked, like they've been shooting them up with cocaine over and over and over again until they're quivering cocaine addicts. If you then take away that cocaine so they want a hit, but you give them a choice between cocaine or sugar, they'll actually prefer sugar in that context, even though they're hooked on cocaine and need a hit physiologically. Sugar is extremely addictive, but it's also, if you think about it, it's ubiquitous, right? There's no place that you can't eat, really, right? And the reason I'm bringing that up is that when you quit a drug, what happens is cues in the environment trigger you to want it again, to have cravings. That's how the craving system works. And one thing that's different about addicts compared to non-addicts in their brain is that addicts have brains that are extra sensitive to the cues that predict that addictive hit. The problem with food cues is they're everywhere, right? You can't get home from work without being barraged by logos and places you've swung through the drive-through and billboards with dripping melting cheese coming at your face, right? You're just trying to get home from work. You're not actually cued to smoke crack on the way home from work, or you're not cued to, shoot heroin in a business meeting at 10 a.m., but the plate of pastries goes around and there's a coffee station with cream and sugar right there, right? So, that's just one little thing. If you want to indulge me, I could go on and mention two more things that are quite prominent in why food is hardest.
Please do.
Well, think about this, John. When you overeat, you get a weight problem, right? Maybe not always, but the weight problem is actually separate. It's ancillary. It's got nothing to do with the food addiction. It's like a side effect, right? It's sort of like, imagine that if you drank alcohol, it gave you really bad acne or something, right? It's something that you don't really want sticking around. It maybe doesn't look good from your perspective. You want it gone, but it's this separate thing, right? But then you stop eating addictively, you've still got the weight. You stop drinking, you've still got the acne, let's just say. And let's imagine it's deadly acne. Like it actually is really not good to just accept it. It's going to kill you years before your time. But then, and this is why I created this analogy, imagine that treating the acne, the treatment for the acne created cravings to drink, overpowering, evolutionarily wired in cravings to go back to the alcohol, which is going to create more acne. That's the situation we're in with food. It creates this weight problem. And the trouble is the brain adapts to whatever your higher weight is. It doesn't want you to lose that weight. It has built-in mechanisms to cue you to eat more as soon as you start to pull off that weight. It does things like increase ghrelin, the hunger hormone. It decreases leptin, the satiety hormone. It slows down your thyroid so that your metabolism stops functioning as well. It cues you hormonally to be driven to go back to eating excessively to drive your weight back to where it was. So you're trying to now treat the weight problem that you got from the food problem, and the weight, like curing the weight problem, sends you back to the food problem. It's a maddening, confounding trap to be stuck in.
When you mentioned that sugar is extremely addictive and that there really is such a thing as food addiction, I was remembering in the 90s, the tobacco industry was being confronted with the reality that tobacco was addictive, and the CEOs of the big tobacco companies were testifying before Congress and denying that tobacco was addictive. And one of the things that one of these executives said, one of the big shots from one of the big tobacco companies, was trying to defend tobaccos. He said, tobacco's no more addictive than Twinkies. Maybe he was right.
Yeah, actually, sugar is more addictive than cigarettes. If you look at those ways that scientists measure addictive strength, sugar is more addictive than nicotine by a fair bit.
Well, one of the reasons for that is that the taste of sugar on the human tongue triggers the release of opiates in our brains. And in turn, this triggers the release of dopamine, which creates a lot of good feelings, a lot of feelings that most of us want. And we know that just about every drug of abuse, be it cocaine or alcohol or heroin or tobacco, by one mechanism or another increases dopamine activity. Susan, does this mean then that the highly sweetened foods we've come to associate with celebration, that we serve our kids on their birthdays, that we use to celebrate all kinds of events and festivities, actually hijack the brain's dopamine system in the same way as addictive drugs like cocaine and heroin do?
Yeah, that's exactly what it means, John. And it doesn't just release the dopamine and activate those centers. And those centers, by the way, are like in the nucleus accumbens and the other reward, pleasure, addiction centers of the brain, but it blows them out and it causes them to downregulate, which means the receptors there become less numerous, less responsive, thinner. And what that means is that you're left in a depleted, kind of itchy, uncomfortable, diseased, disquieted state in between times, because now you don't have enough baseline dopamine on board to just feel okay anymore, unless you go get some more sugar or flour. Flour does it too. And the brains of people who've been hooked on food look just like the brains of people who are hooked on heroin and cocaine. So it's exactly what it means.
Some good news here in the midst of this, of what we're talking about. We're describing something that affects people's lives in a major way and harms people. Our taste buds actually regenerate every 2 weeks. They are some of the shortest living cells in our bodies. They go through mitosis incredibly rapidly. So every 2 weeks, you've got an entirely new complement of taste bud cells. And that illustrates how fast our sense of taste can recalibrate if we stop eating the foods that are addictive. Susan, do the tongue and the taste buds have a direct connection to the addiction centers in the brain?
They do, John. And this is why I recommend that people don't eat stevia if they're trying to quit sugar, because it's just that extra sweet taste in and of itself that can be problematic. It is true that the taste buds have a direct connection to the addiction centers in the brain.
We get addicted to the foods that we're fed in our childhood. We associate them with the experiences of our childhood, some of which may be negative, but a lot of them may be positive. And even if they're negative, they tend to get entrained. They tend to get grooved in us. So overcoming our emotional eating habits is a challenge. And I think is a challenge for everybody, but particularly for people who are higher on the susceptibility scale to addiction and people have trouble with their weight. And this really affects people, as you know, and I just want to mention something to bring this home for our listeners. I saw a recent study Over half the girls between the ages of 18 and 25 said they would rather be run over by a truck than be fat. One woman told me that she remembers being an overweight child and the other kids would sing Baby Beluga when they saw her. And another woman told me about the elaborate measures she takes today to keep her spouse from seeing her naked in the light. Susan, how do you feel when you hear things like this?
I feel compassionate. I feel kind of sick to my stomach. I relate in a certain kind of way. I mean, I was obese by my mid-20s. And I just want to say that those findings are true, and there's plenty of other findings that are equally horrific. Over 90% of healthcare providers, doctors, nurses, and so forth, over 90% on anonymous surveys will agree to statements like obese people are lazy, obese people are stupid, over 90%.
Ouch. Oh.
Yeah. So, and formerly obese people who were obese and now have lost a bunch of weight will, on surveys, will say things like, I would rather accept blindness, deafness, leg amputation than go back to being obese. So research like this makes it clear how incredibly difficult it is to carry excess weight in the society. I have 3 daughters, so this stuff is super present for me. My daughters, are preteens. My hunch is that there are positive changes happening in our societal conception of body size. And I also think some of those changes are problematic and worry me. But the parts that go along with reduced stigma, more compassion and acceptance, less discrimination, less prejudice, I'm just so relieved about, because being overweight in our society has been so hard for so long. And I think disproportionately for women, I think the societal standard has been for a long time that a woman isn't successful, shouldn't feel good about herself if she's carrying excess weight. And I think that's horrible. I think that's got to change.
Oh, I agree. When you're talking about reducing the stigma and having less prejudice, that's something I think we all want to see. We hear a lot these days about body positivity and health at any size. Fat shaming is going out, body acceptance is coming in. And I think there's something important happening here. No one should ever be made to feel less precious or less valuable if they aren't thin. And it's certainly true that as a society, we still tend to hold thinness up as an ideal to such an extent that many women, other men as well, but mostly women, hate their bodies if they don't conform to what amounts to an impossible ideal. But Susan, I question the idea that being fat can be healthy as long as you exercise and lead an active lifestyle. In fact, a study published very recently by the European Study of Cardiology found that being fat is linked with worse heart health even in people who exercise. Susan, what does the data say? Is there solid evidence behind the fat acceptance movement? And how do you relate to the concept of health at any size?
My voice catches because it's such a nuanced topic, John. And if I'm honest, in terms of feelings, I have some anger that comes up around the lack of nuance that I often see in the body positivity, health at any size movements. I think the data are very strong that every excess pound of weight we carry confers health risk. So a huge study, the one you were just referring to, was not a small study. They looked at over 500,000 people, and they looked at the relationship between body size and activity level, like how much someone exercises, and their cardiovascular health. And they showed that no matter how much someone exercises, if they are obese, they have a higher risk of having poor heart health than someone who is not overweight, even if that person is completely sedentary. The study author was quite blunt, frankly. This was a European cardiologist, said, one cannot be fat but healthy. Full stop. And I'm reminded of a notion called the obesity paradox that was a term that was thrown around several years ago. It's been debunked, but I think it was the wind in the sails of the health at any size movement. And I don't know that they've appropriately updated their scientific schemas and the information that they disseminate to people. Very briefly, the obesity paradox was that many, many years ago, a set of studies, some different studies looking at a few different things, but in a related way, showed that mysteriously people who carried a little extra weight tended to live longer. That it looked like, hey, actually having some fat on you could be a really good thing. And then similarly, there were data that showed that losing weight is correlated with increased odds of death. And they said, don't try to lose weight. Don't try to lose weight. Carry your extra weight, be proud, exercise, you're fine. Now, all the data, someone, poked and prodded at the studies, and someone ran the numbers again, taking out all the people who were fatally ill with colon cancer, with AIDS. These were huge epidemiological studies, and they were run without factoring in terminal diseases that go along with stripping the body of excess weight before dying an awful death, right? And so if you run the data again, removing anyone with a fatal diagnosis, and you run the data again, removing anyone who's losing weight unintentionally because they're ill, what emerges is the true pattern for the rest of us, which is that if you don't have a fatal diagnosis, every pound of weight you carry that's excess confers additional risk of all-cause mortality. And trying to lose weight intentionally is actually a very good thing. You want to get that excess weight off. So that's what the data show, John.
Susan, I've been hearing you say for years, because I've known you for years, that we have a very long way to go to identify the seriousness of our obesity problem. The global pandemic that we're dealing with now is bringing to the forefront another level of how dangerous it can be to be unhealthy, and in particularly to be obese. Obese people are not only far more likely to become very ill if they develop COVID than people who maintain a healthy weight. Obese people are also 3 times more likely to die. Susan, is COVID-19 highlighting some of the seriousness of obesity from a health perspective?
Well, it is, John. And interestingly, as far as I know, it's the first cause of death I've seen that's got a direct link to obesity. Obesity was a direct risk factor for death from COVID. Not obesity is problematic because then your lungs are more likely to be this, that, or the other, or because then you're more likely to have high this marker or that marker or whatever. It was like, even if you're apparently not suffering from anything else, just you're at this moment obese, that's enough, right, to be more likely to die from COVID. So I thought that was very interesting. Is it highlighting the seriousness of our obesity problem? John, I'd like to say it is, but I don't know that it is, because for the last year, there wasn't a rallying cry of, okay, everyone, it's now the writing's on the wall. It's really time to get healthy. The gig is up, right? Like, let's band together, do what we can for each other and our own health, and support each other in finally making the dietary changes we all know that we have needed to make for a long time. Why aren't we saying, okay, now it's really time to put major taxes on candy bars and soda. It's time to not allow advertising of sugar cereals to kids, right? In the same way we don't allow advertising of cigarettes to kids. It's time to change what's allowed in vending machines in schools, in school lunch programs, right? So is it highlighting what's going on really with our obesity pandemic? I don't know, John. I don't see evidence of that.
Well, I agree with you that it's time for the measures you just mentioned. High time, long time ago, it was time. Honestly. I'm thinking that there are a lot of people listening to us right now. There are hundreds of thousands of people listening to us right now. And some of them undoubtedly are obese. And when they hear this news about obesity and COVID-19, when they hear that the idea that just exercising is not going to make them healthy if they remain fat, I could imagine them feeling overwhelmed, maybe even hopeless. Susan, what is your message to them?
Oh, gosh. I mean, number one is just, I love you. I care. I have struggled with my weight on and off most of my life. What I've eaten or not eaten has been the major subject du jour for me for more hours and minutes than I care to say. And food is the hardest. And I just want to say, you're not alone. You're not alone. I want to say around me in my ecosphere, you will never, to my hope, never ever experience judgment, recrimination, shaming. Like, I just get it. It is so hard. And we are stuck in an environment that works against us 24/7, 365. It is the hardest to be addicted to food or to feel cravings or compulsion to eat things that, it's the worst too, because you're sitting there knowing that you shouldn't be eating that, right? It's the worst. So that's the first thing I just want to say. Just safe zone. I just get it. Like, it's okay. And if and when you ever get to a place where you really want to do something about it, I want to be there to help. There really is hope. There really is something to do about it. And I also want to say, you got to be willing to pony up, because it's not the like, eat all you want and take this pill and you'll be fine. That's not what you're going to hear if you come talking to me. It's rigorous to take off your excess weight and keep it off. It's an intense thing to try to do. You got to be rigorous about it. But there is hope. And the research that showed that diets don't work, and there's a whole body of research that shows that research was not done in any way, shape, or form trying the approaches that I use that work with the brain in a whole different way. There is a way to effectively lose your excess weight and keep it off. So that's what I want to say.
Well, it is rigorous. Your program is rigorous. And two of the bright lines that Bright Line Eating employs are deal with sugar and flour. People in your program don't eat sugar and don't eat flour. Susan, when people give up eating sugar and flour, do their brains actually heal? I mean, do the dopamine neurons in the portion of the brain known as the nucleus accumbens actually regenerate? And does this then actually allow them to break free from cravings?
That's such a great question, John. And I wish I had the smoking gun answer for you. I wish I could point to a study that looks at the brain and says, look, there's the regenerated dopamine receptors. There isn't such a study. It's never been done. I hope to rectify that before I die. However, what I can say is we know where those cravings come from. They come from the nucleus accumbens and dopamine downregulation. Those cravings that have you putting on your coat in a snowstorm at 1 or 2 in the morning to go to the convenience store to get a pint of ice cream, right? Those cravings. And what we see is that at the end of just 8 weeks, people in our Bright Line Eating Bootcamp on average are experiencing little to no cravings ever. And that's data collected over thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people. I cannot imagine how that would happen if that didn't mean that on average, that portion of the brain was experiencing profound dopamine re-regulation within those 8 weeks. That's what we see. So we see it on the clinical side, but I don't have the brain imaging smoking gun for you yet.
Well, seeing it on the clinical side matters. And I'm thinking about...
It sure matters to those people who don't have to go get that ice cream in the middle of the night anymore. Yeah.
It sure does. And I'm thinking about what happens then, Susan. I mean, a lot of us have used food to suppress difficult feelings. We use food to create distance from painful experiences that we don't know a better way to cope with. And some of us are afraid to change because we know how much we stuff down. And we fear that if we were to become leaner and healthier, if we were to stop using food to numb ourselves, we would have to face the feelings we've been avoiding. And even with all the greater aliveness and vitality that comes with healthier eating, we're afraid that we wouldn't have the capacity to face these challenges, to deal with these feelings. Susan, if we've been used to using food to suppress feelings, and a lot of us do that, what's going to happen if we stop doing that?
That's such a great question, John. And the amazing thing is when you stop using food to suppress your feelings, the feelings come up and need to be dealt with, but not all at once. The magical thing is called one day at a time, one meal at a time, one feeling at a time. And what happens is people who really commit to a Bright Line approach are afraid, typically at first, that they're going to be overwhelmed by the enormity of not being able to use food as a crutch. But one challenging situation at a time, one craving at a time, one urge at a time, one fit of anger at a time, little by slow, they're able to find a different way of coping with their feelings. And we focus on that a lot in my program. And I recommend that anyone who decides to really change the way they eat, put a lot of thought into that and a lot of attention on that. What are my substitutions? Where's my support coming from? What am I going to do differently? What am I going to do? I mean, I help people craft an emergency action plan, right? What are you going to do when the feeling rises up and you're thinking, oh, I'd be eating over this for sure. You feel the pull to the fridge, to the drive-through, to the whatever. What's your emergency action plan? What are you going to do in that moment to handle it differently? And it can be simple as we teach people the acronym BFF, which doesn't stand for best friends forever, like you're a teenage kid. It stands for breathe, feel your body, find your feet. It can be that simple. You just come back to yourself and you realize that you actually have a lot of skills for handling emotions. You don't need to eat over that. And so you build more and more capacity over time. It becomes a beautiful upward spiral.
Well, when someone creates bright lines for their healthy eating path and decides there's certain foods they just are not going to eat, it seems almost inevitable in our society that at some point something's going to happen and that will lead them to breaking one of their bright lines, falling off the wagon, so to speak. Susan, when that happens, what do we need to remember? What are there questions we should ask ourselves, things we should do, steps we can take, things to bear in mind in order to get back on track?
Yeah, great question, John. So first of all, not everyone breaks their bright lines. Most people do at some point, but we have a lot of people in our community that really just commit. They have a full identity shift. And, just like I've been clean and sober for 26 years, people actually do just stick with their bright lines. But in that moment when you have broken a bright line, I think it's important to have support to be able to lean into. In psychology, there's a term called co-regulation. And the idea is, we're not all a mess on the same day. So if you have someone else to lean into, that can be really helpful and they can remind you of some really good adaptive strategies. I think it's really important at that moment to take stock of your program, right? Because, look, John, there's I'm going to adopt some bright lines. I want to be generally healthier, but I'm starting off without really a weight problem. And I'm starting off, like someone who decides to give up meat and dairy, for example, and they're committed to it. But, frankly, in their world, if they have whatever it is, a piece of cheese or whatever, it's not life shattering, right? And then you've got the person who, just lost 250 pounds, right? And they have been immaculate with their food plan. And now they've just eaten a piece of pie, right? Those are different situations. And I think it's important to recognize that difference, right? So breaking bright lines is something that I think it's important as much as possible to stay in our grounded highest self, to navigate through that situation, to use support, to think about our program. Have we been slipping in our identity, in our habits, in our food prep? Are we set up for success? Like that person who just lost 250 pounds and has not broken their food plan this whole time, my prescription as an expert for them would be, you need to be in a community, really working a formal program and staying in it long term, because the data show that people who drift from whatever approach they're trying to follow gain back their weight, right? If you're not actively involved. And the reason for that is the outside world will erode your identity as a healthy eater. The outside world doesn't get it. The outside world says, come on, you're not going to have pumpkin pie on Thanksgiving. What are you? You've already lost so much weight. Live a little, right? There's no respect for the kind of deference someone gives me when I say I don't drink champagne because I'm a recovering alcoholic on New Year's Eve, right? People are like, oh, great. Okay, I'll get you some sparkling water. People out there don't get it. So if you're not surrounding yourself with people who are going to reinforce your highest, best good, then maybe it's time to make a change. You just broke your bright lines. Maybe you need to reassess your program.
Even for alcoholics, even for people who are wanting to not drink, even though you're right. Now, if they say, I'm a recovering alcoholic, I'll pass, that's generally respected now, but it's still an uphill battle for alcoholics, and they need bright lines. And AA is well known for helping people who have a problem with alcohol not to drink at all. It's a bright line. It's not about controlled drinking if you're in AA. Or any of the other
Right.
12-step programs. It's about stopping.
Right.
And that was my first exposure to bright lines, was how 12-step programs use them. How is bright line eating different? And how is it the same as 12-step programs?
Yeah, there are a lot of similarities. I mean, I'm a 12-stepper through and through. There are a lot of similarities, but one of the big differences is the science. Big difference. 12-step programs are based on folklore, essentially, right? Campfire stories. They get passed down from sponsor to sponsee, from sponsor to sponsee, a bunch of people sitting around at meetings. They never claimed to be based in science. And actually, there's a little bit of an eschewing of science, honestly, where looking into causes and conditions is sort of poo-pooed, which I think it can be okay. If what you're doing is working, that's fine. In the food realm, there's a range of different 12-step options. And in my experience, this is just my personal opinion, I'm going to step way out on a limb here. From what I've experienced, and I have not just a little bit of experience in 12-step food rooms and lots of them, different programs, different meetings, different locations around the country, I don't feel currently that there's any 12-step food program that really hits the sweet spot of, on the one hand, rigorous commitment to a way of eating, a food plan that eliminates the addictive foods. No sugar, no flour, weighing and measuring your food. And enough respect for people's self-leadership in terms of owning their own program and knowing what's right for them and knowing what they need, and not having controlling, sometimes unsafe, unwise sponsorship dominating people's choices and ability to sort of structure their life. I haven't found a 12-step food program that hits that sweet spot. So I think in Bright Line Eating, we hit that sweet spot where we're very rigorous about how we handle the food. We also build in a lot of compassion and lack of judgment. That's missing, in my opinion, in the more stringent 12-step food programs. And of course, Bright Line Eating is a business, right? I mean, we take great care of our employees. We're very proud of how we run our business, but it is a business. We have employees that deliver what we do. So it's different in that way. And it's mostly online. So it's not based on face-to-face meetings. Yeah. Those are some of the ways that it's different.
Well, I appreciate that you bring so much compassion and lack of judgment. I think that's, in today's world, just critical. The 12-step programs are well known for the Serenity Prayer, which I have often thought could as well be called the Courage Prayer, because we ask for the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, but we also ask for the courage to change the things we can. And of course, we ask also for the wisdom to know the difference. Susan, a lot of people have tried dieting over and over again and have so often regained whatever weight they managed to lose that they now have come to believe that they have to simply do the best they can with the body that they have. And that's the compassionate thing to accept and appreciate. They look at their weight as something they cannot change. Susan, what would you want to tell people who've come to that conclusion?
Well, I would just want to say, I really understand, because I did that for sure. I absolutely reached a point where I concluded that losing weight was hopeless, that I'd tried so many times, so many different things, and that clearly, obviously, my experiential life data were pointing me in the direction of I had to just accept myself the way I was. And that maybe if I did that, things would be better somehow. And the trouble, John, was that accepting my body, my life, my food exactly the way it was, it helped a lot of things, actually. It helped me ease up a lot. But at a baseline rate of eating, the way I just ate, I was gaining 5 pounds a month. And you can do the math. That doesn't go good places. So within a year of trying the I need to just accept myself thing, I was back to thinking, okay, I got to do something about this weight. And I'm just so glad I finally got off that merry-go-round. I mean, what I want to say again to the person who is in that place is there is something you can do about your weight. And it does require some acceptance. It's kind of, it's a little bit being stuck between a rock and a hard place. I don't know of any way that you get to eat whatever you want whenever you want and handle your weight problem too in this society. I mean, once these heavily processed foods were created and dropped in, they are drugs into our food environment. Some of us, the ones with highly addictable brains, and it's about a third of the population, some of us, we're kind of screwed until we, resolve to just not eat them at all. So, yeah.
If you look throughout human history, we existed for the most part in survival mode, in a context of scarcity and unpredictability. And we've been programmed with a powerful drive to eat as much as we can when we can, and then to store the calories we don't need at the moment on our bodies for later use when food might not be available. I mean, food availability was never something we could take for granted. And so those who stored the most fat for the future were often the ones most able to survive subsequent food shortages. So generation after generation, millennia after millennia, the evolutionary advantage went to those who stored the most body fat.
Yeah.
Susan, what happens when this genetic programming meets the modern food supply?
Yeah, John, exactly. It's a disaster. We so did not evolve for this particular food environment. And it is true when you look at few indigenous hunter-gatherer societies still, and they've been studied how they eat, and they binge. They binge sometimes, they magically, once in a blue moon, get a beehive, a honeycomb away from the bees. And they'll just sit and eat, 4,000 calories of honey in one sitting. Heck yeah, they will. They'll sit and eat 6 oranges. Like, oh my gosh, the oranges are ripe, That's exactly how we evolved, was to gorge when we could, because lean times were always coming, always. And what happens when that brain meets our food environment is we pack on excess weight and the brain has an adiposity set point. The more recent theory is settling point, because it will change if you adjust your activity level and caloric intake long term. It will go down. However, often not fully. And the brain fights you in losing weight. It protects that higher weight. It's almost as if the brain starts to think, 300 pounds is my natural weight. And then when you've lost 50 pounds or 100 pounds, it thinks, oh my gosh, I'm starving. And it's really like, no, you're not. You still got 40 pounds of fat on you. But the brain doesn't see it that way. And so, like I referenced earlier, it makes all kinds of hormonal modifications to try to force you to gain back that weight. And that's why yo-yo weight loss and weight regain is so common.
And the food industry knows all about this and seeks to exploit it, seeks to prey on people's susceptibilities. They actually hire scientists who they call, this is an industry term, craveability experts. And their job is to increase the craveability of the foods they engineer, they manufacture, they provide to us in our supermarkets. It seems to me that craveability is a euphemism for addiction. They are actually intentionally increasing the addictive component of the foods they market.
Yeah.
And this then creates an environment where this is normalized. And then for all of us, finding a healthy eating path means saying no to these people, saying no to the products that they've engineered in that way.
Yeah, it does. And, I learned just recently in the last few months that they've started to buy fMRI time. So just for folks who don't know, fMRI machines are, premier brain imaging machines. They're ridiculously expensive. And to make up the investment, a hospital needs to keep them in use pretty much round the clock, 24 hours a day. And time in an fMRI magnet is extremely expensive. And big food companies have started to buy time in fMRI scanners, put people in there eating different formulations of various snack foods, and they've started to study the impact, the dopamine surge in the addictive centers of the brain to find the formulation that wallops the best punch in terms of addictive hit. And yeah, it's pretty scary. I mean, I guess doing right by their shareholders, right? That's what people need. That's what people are looking for. They need the best hit. So that's what they're going to buy. I think as I look at the landscape, our demographics in Bright Line Eating are mostly female, mostly middle-aged. And I've been thinking, gosh, I had a hope to die food problem in my teens already. I'm thinking, how do we get younger people into Bright Line Eating? And what I've heard is that a message that's going to resonate with them is don't let those companies addict you. Basically, don't sell out to the man, right? It's sort of it's a war cry that I think I've heard is going to really resonate with the younger generation, that the idea of that manipulation makes them mad. I mean, it makes me mad. Yeah.
It makes me angry too. And I no longer think it's a stretch to compare the processed food manufacturers with the tobacco companies.
It's pretty analogous. Yeah, it's pretty analogous.
When will we see warning labels like we now have on cigarette packages on the ultra-processed foods that make up 3/4 of the calories eaten by the average American in their diet today?
Yeah, right. And I think really all that's needed, just like with cigarettes, all that's needed is a rising up from the people. If people just decide the gig is up, it will be up. We just aren't seeing it. People are sleeping.
That's why we think we need a food revolution.
Exactly.
Susan, I have huge respect for your work, and I've had the privilege of knowing you for years and meeting so many people who've benefited so greatly from your programs. I think of all the cases of diabetes that have been averted, and of all the people who are now more present in their lives and feel more confident in their bodies and who can now show up more fully for the people that they love. There's a saying that what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. And I see the wisdom of that playing out in your life because you've overcome so much and it has indeed made you stronger. And you're using that strength. And this is something I truly appreciate about you. You're using the strength and the insights that you've gained on your difficult and challenging path to help others in so many meaningful ways. And I feel privileged to know you and to be your friend and colleague, and certainly to have your voice and wisdom as part of this summit. On behalf of Ocean and myself and everyone involved in the food revolution, Susan, I thank you for your profoundly important work and, of course, for being with us today.
Thanks, John. Such a pleasure.
We've been talking with Dr. Susan Peirce Thompson, president of the Institute for Sustainable Weight Loss and author of multiple New York Times bestsellers, including Bright Line Eating. If you want to connect with Susan's work and to take a quiz she developed to find out how susceptible you are to food addiction, you can visit foodrevolution.org/food quiz. Again, that's foodrevolution.org/food quiz. Susan, at one level, your work's about weight loss, but at a deeper level, it's about love, it's about integrity, it's about health, and of course, it's about freedom. We thank you so much for your keen insights, for your vitally important work, for your friendship, and for your partnership in the food revolution.
Thanks, Ocean.
This concludes our interview, but our work is just getting started. If you feel supported and encouraged by what you just heard and want to share it with people you care about, if you want permanent access to 24 amazing presentations and transcripts, then check this out. You can get a download and a transcript of the entire Food Revolution Summit, plus a huge collection of ebooks, courses, trainings, recipes, and videos. And this empowerment package is available for a huge 50% discount